Hi, friends. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS. And I'm so pleased that you've joined us once again for, unless it's your first time, for our Times of Crisis and Possibility series, exploring pivotal moments in the Jewish experience with JTS faculty and fellows. And if it is your first time joining us today, we're especially pleased to welcome you to the series. We have a wonderful session planned for today. The immigration crises then and now, what are 21st century possibilities? We're so thrilled to have Ruth Messenger as JTS's Finkelstein Institute Social Justice Fellow, and as you probably know, she's also Global Ambassador of the American Jewish World Service. And she's going to be teaching us today about our Jewish history as immigrants in ancient and modern times, and bring that to bear on how we consider the status and treatment of immigrants today in the US and elsewhere. So just before I turn it over to Ruth, just a few announcements and technical instructions. So I wanted to thank Rabbi Tim Bernard, Director of Digital Learning at JTS, and the rest of the community engagement team, which is quite a number of people who have been part of putting this series together. And just on that note, I wanted to tell you we're really excited. We've decided to extend the series into August because we've had such tremendous response. I think this concept of exploring past moments of crisis and also possibility in Jewish history and Jewish texts and the Jewish experience seems to have struck a great chord. So we're really thrilled about that. And we're planning several new sessions approaching that question from many different angles and fields. So we will keep you posted. So just some technical instructions. You will probably wish to use speaker view rather than gallery view so that you can see Ruth up close. So you can toggle between those two as you wish. The reason I'm distracted is because I have a second grader on a very loud Zoom very close by. So I'm not sure why it's so loud, but they're having fun. It's good. So if you want to see gallery, you can toggle back and forth between speaker and gallery view, as you probably know. Questions. We're going to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. When Ruth pauses during the class, and especially for Q&A at the end, to raise your hand, click on participants on your Zoom menu bar and look for the hand icon. You can click it to raise, click it again to lower. Feel free to test it out if you'd like. If you're participating by phone, you can raise your hand by dialing *9, and again, *9 to lower your hand. And Tim will call on you when it's your turn, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. If we do any screen sharing today, you should be aware that you can click on a view options menu, and you can adjust the vertical line back and forth if you want to see the material that's being screen shared larger, or if you want to see the speaker larger, you have that option. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received from Lynn Feynman a little while ago, the same email that contained the Zoom link for the session. Those are all my announcements. And Ruth, we are so thrilled to have you with us today, and I turn it over to you. And you've got to unmute yourself.
Okay, I am unmuted and I'm here. Julia, thanks a lot, and thanks very much to you and JTS for asking me to do this, and thanks tremendously to Tim Bernard, who's been hugely helpful with all of the logistics. I want to say to all of you, we are talking about immigration, and I will be a little more specific in a minute, but I would be remiss if I did not say that in everybody's mind, I believe, and certainly my own, the events of this weekend and the reminders about issues of race division, racism, and violence are unfortunately alive in many of our cities and probably in many of our minds. And it's information, it's issue that represents issues that I'm working on at JTS and with JTS students. And I appreciate hearing from any or all of you about it outside of today's meeting. what we're going to do, as I think you know, is look into the story of immigration, a little bit in the Bible, in the modern world, in the Jewish community, and in the United States. We're going to consider what some of the sources are of caring for and of antagonism to immigrants and immigration, particularly as these exist today, and with some reference to the era of the virus. And we're going to spend some time considering what more might be done in response to the range of problems that we confront. I'm aware that for many of you who are dedicated attendees at this series, this is different from an opportunity to drill down carefully in specific text. So I welcome all your questions, but it will be a different sort of presentation than many that have occurred on previous Mondays. But I'm going to start with there's not going to be that much screen sharing, but we're going to start with a short story, and I've asked Tim to bring it up on the screen and to read it, and then there will be a couple of questions. Go ahead, Tim.
Escaping from persecution and torture and expulsion, an unknown number of people set out by water in a wooden boat. Captured by privateers on the high seas, several were sent back to ruling authorities, while 23 men, women, and children found another vessel for their journey of escape. The second ship's captain agreed to take them on in exchange for all of their possessions and a substantial amount of money. Now penniless and homeless, the ship finally came to the end of its journey at a windswept little town far from any people like themselves. Not only was the journey not an easy one, neither was their welcome. The captain of the ship put their belongings up for auction to get cash, and the local governor did not want these 23 to infest his land. Thus did their fight continue, against both the captain and the governor.
Okay, so you see the questions. These refugees, are they the people now fleeing Syria and Libya? Are they the people fleeing Myanmar and going to Bangladesh? Are they the people who are fleeing Central America by boat in order to try to make land in the United States? Or are they another group? And we don't have the leeway here of engaging in a long back and forth with a chat room and questions. So a couple of you are making great guesses, but Leslie Verter wins. So Tim, if you can spotlight Leslie quickly, he's going to answer. He or she is going to answer. Oh, now there's a competition. Okay, so several of you apparently know the answer, and it's in the chat room, and that's fantastic. So these are the immigrants who were fleeing from Recife, Brazil, to what turned out to be the tiny Dutch outpost of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. The next piece of information about that trip is that the governor, who was referred to in what Tim read to you, Peter Stuyvesant, did not want them to land. And he wrote his bosses at the Dutch East India Company back in Amsterdam these words, and I quote, "The Jews have arrived with their customary usury and deceitful trading. Owing to their present indigence, they might become a charge in the coming winter," end quote. So these refugees were, not for every single one of us, I hear the accents, but were for most of us, our ancestors on these American shores. And they stayed because Peter Stuyvesant's plea to the Dutch East India Company was rejected. I want to tell you one other story as we get started. This is actually an experience I had working for American Jewish World Service in northeastern Peru in an isolated fishing village where a farmer was introduced to us, and then he said that he didn't understand the term, this was in Spanish, the term American Jew, because everyone knew that all Jews came from Israel. So in my rather limited and bad Spanish, I had a light bulb went on, and I said to him, no, you should think about the Bible. The Jews were the people who wandered for 40 years. He thought for a minute, and then he said, aha, refugios, comprendo. So folks, that is who we are. Wanderers, refugees, immigrants. Too often, we were being expelled from the land, fleeing Pharaoh, searching for the promised land, looking for a place we could settle, live, enjoy the personal, political, religious freedom that we craved. And those experiences are often at the root of our text-based obligation to care for the other and the stranger, because we know what it was like to have been victims of exclusion and oppression. And it is for sure not just the Exodus story, nor is it the escape to America from Brazil in the 17th century that defines this aspect of our lives. Much more familiar even to all of you, including those who guessed the secret, there is the story of immigrant streams of the Jews into America in the 19th and 20th centuries, and then increasingly of our departure from countries where we could not live freely, where we were being persecuted, and eventually of our flight from Hitler and the Nazi determination to exterminate us. Each of you on this call, each of us has our own story. The fact is that unless you are Native American, we are all immigrants or people descended from immigrants. We did not originally own the land on which we now live and work. It was shepherded for us by tribes long before we or our parents or our great-grandparents or our great-grandparents got to America. What I'm interested in, one of the things I'm interested in, is that people, and I'm talking now in the Jewish community specifically, people know their immigrant stories in different degrees. Increasingly, in my experience, people are more likely to know their country of origin, going back 2 or 3 or 4 generations, and less likely to know exactly why their ancestors came to this country or how, whether their entry was legal or not. That is not true for survivors of the Holocaust, who tend to know their family stories in great detail, but it is true for many other, and particularly younger Jews. In other words, what I'm saying is that these immigrant stories are fading in many families. And the consequence, unfortunately, is leading to generations who think of themselves and their families as rooted in the United States. And then, sadly, from my point of view, they then turn to see the people coming here today, the people massed on our borders, the people trying to get access to America, as the other. And they see those people as a threat in some fashion to our way of life. And that contributes in some places, and we all know this, to the use of dangerous language. People talking about invasions, people actually yelling at people on the street to go back where you came from. These over-the-top expressions may not be ones that you use or hear personally, but they are sadly part of the current discourse. And they reflect, perhaps even more sadly, they reflect the sentiments of some people we know who use nicer language, but who reflect those positions. Tim, do you have any questions that you want me to break for?
We have one question from William.
Okay.
I'm just curious. Everybody with our community, everybody compares the new immigrants to the Jews trying to escape the Holocaust and being immigrants escaping other places. But when we came here, in our culture, in our upbringing, we were not taught to hate the United States. We came to join a place that was free. We have immigrants from countries who were, in a sense, brainwashed their whole lives to hate the United States. And when we bring them in with very bad vetting, if any vetting whatsoever, and I feel that there's a major difference and they should be treated. They should be aided. If they're having problems, aid them in place. But just to open up our shores to people who have been brought up to try to destroy us, I think is silly.
Okay, so that is a very clear opinion. If we didn't have the rest of this presentation to go through, we could debate a good deal of that. I understand exactly what you're saying. I want to disagree with you on one point very specifically, and that is the vetting. The vetting that this country applies to people trying to enter has always been quite intense and is infinitely more intense now. So that I promise you, people are vetted. And the question of what their attitudes are, I guess I just want to say that it's very hard for people to leave their country. They only leave if they have a reason, there's a set of reasons. But I think that if we looked collectively at the immigrant experience, including our own, we would find some people who were unhappy about moving, but many, many, many more who were excited to put down roots in a new country. Let me continue and we can come back to those questions later. So what happened over a couple of centuries after Brazil to the immigrants, Jews and others who were seeking the American promised land? The history is decidedly mixed. When we were a new nation in 1790, we defined citizens as free white persons. You could only vote if you were male, white, and owned property. And we were not sure as a country who else we wanted to allow in. So without having time to do the history, and it's very much available, it's even available on Wikipedia, the 230 years since then have seen restrictions that were loosened and tightened, both as to who was a citizen with full voting rights, which is a related issue, and as to who could come into the United States. And again, I want to go back and say that many of you, if you know or you uncover the immigrant stories or the arrival stories of your families, you would see that. For Jews, more or less, now I'm just encapsulating a couple of hundred years, folks, but we have a long history of relatively unfettered immigration from about 1840 over a period of time when millions came for opportunity and to work to build the new country. As many of you know, because it speaks to your family history, my family as well, beginning after 1880, 2 million Jews came who were fleeing oppression in Europe. Some of us can trace our arrival in this country to those ancestors. But, and this goes very much to the discussion we were just having and some of the discussion I see in the chat, but just as there were waves of immigrants and waves of new settlement, so too were there waves of xenophobia. At various points, there were restrictions on Chinese and Japanese immigrants, and there were complaints about Irish, Italians, and Jews. As one example, there was a battle in the Midwest in Omaha, Nebraska in 1909, organized by an Irish man to rid the area of Greeks because he said they were arriving in droves and they were not likely to mix. So on the one hand, migrant labor was needed, but on the other hand, suspicion and hostility grew. Without looking at all of those stories, although there are a lot of them, I want to turn your attention to 1920 to 24, which is when the big crackdown came. There had been a fierce and growing response by immigrants who were here, who got here, who had roots in Northwest Europe and Scandinavia. They didn't want too many people to come in, and they particularly decided that they didn't want people to come in from Southern or Eastern Europe. So they painted those people as inferior races. And they decided that they didn't want Jews to come in because our religion was different. So starting in the late 1930s, laws began to be adopted in the United States. The laws preferenced limited numbers of refugees and immigrants, that is, we set a ceiling, but we also said that they could only come from countries whose people already had a foothold here. So the legislative determination of the United States was to look at this is now 1920 more or less, was to look at the 1890 census and say, okay, if Italians made up, if Spanish made up a certain percentage of the population in 1890, then that's the same population percentage that we will allow immigrants in, but we won't allow other people. That was targeted against many groups, some from Asia, some from Eastern Europe, and it was specifically targeted against Jews. The Jewish immigration was reduced by 90% following the immigration laws of 1920 and 24. And a supportive legislator said proudly, quote, "This will end the notion of America as a melting pot." So one interesting trivia fact is that more immigrants entered the United States in the first decade of the 20th century, so that is before 1920, before 1910, than were able to enter the United States between 1931 and 1971. So more in the first 10 years of the 20th century than in the 40 years when we know that for a variety of reasons that many of us know firsthand or secondhand, people were trying to get into this country. A poll in 1938 specifically recorded 2/3 of Americans as being opposed to additional Jewish refugees. And this is a point I hope to really drive home today, it was the laws of 1920 and 1924 that were used in the late 1930s and in the 1940s to prevent Jews who were fleeing Hitler from entering the United States. These laws were specifically behind our refusal to allow the St. Louis to dock. I'm going to interrupt myself for a minute to tell you a piece of powerful trivia that I learned this year, just because I like it. I hope you will like it as well. Eleanor Roosevelt told a biographer in the last years of her life that her greatest regret in her entire lifetime was her failure to change her husband's mind with regard to the docking of the St. Louis. And there was a much less well-known refugee ship called the Kwanzaa that was actually allowed to land in 1940 because of her intervention. Okay, so then we're going to fast forward again. Many of you will remember that these same debates did not stop in the second half of the 20th century. Whom would we admit? How many? Would we have special policies for the Vietnamese? For the Laotians who helped on the ground during the Vietnam War? For Soviet Jews, where many of us were involved? For the Muslim Rohingya population who are today victims of an ongoing genocide in Burma and Myanmar? They indeed have fled by boats. They are in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and they are not being admitted to the United States. So in every instance, each of these decades, really going over a couple of hundred years, the question was, would our country be helped or be hurt by immigration? What should be the attitude of our government to people who wanted to arrive here? I do want to say, in response to the question I answered before, that we actually have data. I'm not going to go into this today, but we have a lot of data on the ways in which immigrants have contributed to the growth of the United States. Many of us know that because we know what our ancestors did to make a home here, to set up businesses here, to help build the communities into which they moved. And unfortunately, that not stop a line of mythology about immigrants as constituting a danger to our society or our economy. Just a side note there, we're going to be talking a little later about things that people might do on this issue. And I want to say that in some parts of the country, what's the expression, unusual bedfellow, an interesting ally in supporting more immigration comes from leading business people, both agricultural and service economy, who rely on immigrants to staff their businesses or to pick their fruits and vegetables. And they have actually challenged the White House and the State Department on its immigration crackdown because they can't get the workers that they need. Tim, this would be another point for a question if there is one.
Nothing
Okay,
currently.
I'm gonna keep going. You're saying great things in the chat room. So Tim, just let me know when you see another question or two, because I want to bring us now up to today. And I first want you to understand the global perspective on this. Drop the question of the United States from your mind for a minute. Throughout the world today, including, by the way, in Israel, there are 70 million immigrants and refugees. People who are fleeing their country of origin because of radical climate change, because of civil wars and military assaults, because of new and contemporary genocides, people desperate to join relatives in the United States, and people still wooed by the idea of the American dream. But 70 million is a very, very large number. This is an issue and a problem for almost every country in the world. Some of these immigrants are in refugee camps across the border from what was home. That's true about the Rohingya residents of Myanmar who are now in Bangladesh. Some of them are fleeing on boats with hopes of finding a new country. Some of them are in their own countries, but they're classified as internally displaced persons, a phrase that we're familiar with from our own history, but this is a different notion. These are people who couldn't continue to live in the region of their country where they were living because they were persecuted and attacked, but they've ended up in refugee camps elsewhere not refugee camps, sorry, my mistake, in camps for internally displaced persons elsewhere in their own countries. And then we have to mention the people who are lined up at our borders. In the last several months, because of everything else that's gone on in this country, including the pandemic that we're all dealing with, that's fallen a little bit out of the headlines. But I think you know the stories. We have at our own borders separated children from their parents, put them in cage-like structures that fail to meet any minimum standard of care. We have also, as some of you may know, moved children who were started out in those cages, but who made it across the border to different parts of the United States and put them in foster care, denying them any connection to their parents who are quite logically searching for them. So I have to say quite bluntly that these current policies of the United States violate existing United States and international law, particularly making it possible for impossible, or I would say not quite impossible, but almost impossible for people to apply for asylum. We have had as many as 12 or 13,000 children in custody, most often kept without adequate care or supplies. We are perpetrating direct violations of individuals' human rights, and as many of you will understand, doing immeasurable damage to children's psyches. And let me quote from a report put out by the United Synagogue and the RA last year, which reads, "Taking children away from their families is unconscionable. This added drama negatively impacts physical and mental health. How we treat the stranger reflects on the moral values and ideals of this nation." The people who were in charge at the border, the people working for our government, you can take your choice, either do not know what this is doing to those children, or they know and they don't care. The policies that we are articulating now as a country to take no more people in, to see what we can do to get rid of those who have crossed the border, that means to deport whomever we can, and to move towards zero, the actual number of immigrants to be allowed, are precisely the policies, flashback, that I mentioned before, that were used 100 years ago, 80 years ago, to turn away the St. Louis. One comment about the virus. The virus is being used to make this worse in every possible way. First of all, we're keeping people in captivity in America in very close quarters. Second of all, we're sending people back to Mexico when we know that people who come from any place in Latin America and the Caribbean, back to Mexico, where we know that they have no place to live, much less to quarantine. We are moving toward, if not a policy, then a practice of admitting no immigrants, arguing that they are vectors for COVID-19. And most distressingly, when we deport people back to Mexico or Guatemala or Haiti, we are putting them on planes, some of them minors, without doing COVID testing. And it is clear from the reports from people in those countries that we are sending people with the virus into countries that have no health infrastructure, no access to clean water, and no soap. In all of the statements by government leaders, these immigrants are portrayed as invaders, as disease carriers, as a threat to our way of life, as people lying about their circumstances in order to be admitted. Some of the old myths about who immigrants are and why they are dangerous reappear, but the facts are different. I want to just take you for a minute to the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that I know the best. People are leaving Guatemala and Haiti and Mexico and the Dominican Republic because of extreme danger on the ground. In many cases, their land is being stolen, whether by their own governments or by multinational corporations. Now, this is really an important point that you may not be aware of. What land that they may have and farm is losing its agricultural capacity due to climate change. So areas are getting either too hot and dry or too regularly soaked by rain to make it possible for farmers who usually were talking about an eighth or a quarter of an acre on which to feed their families, makes them impossible to grow anything. And something which I think someone put in the chat a few minutes ago, but I just want to mention that indigenous communities in these countries are being overrun by gangs. Gangs that will murder a woman's brother and tell her that if she is still in place when they return in a week or two, her children will be next. In Guatemala, to be specific, 60% of the people live under the poverty line, 80% of those in indigenous communities. Half the children under 5 in the entire country are malnourished and will have little or no access to education or employment. The country is rife with corruption and violence, and people who flee and attempt to get across the border are fleeing for the same mix of reasons that our ancestors and really all other immigrants have always left. There's a contemporary poem which I thought about sharing with you, but it's too long to share in its entirety, and I can, Tim and Julia can figure out a way to post it and share it with you afterwards. But it has in it the following lines. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one would leave home unless they know that anywhere is safer than here. Okay, also because of the virus, like one more point, and that is this is a time when arguments against letting anyone in hold attention, understandably, because people in this country are worried about our health, we're worried about employment, we're worried about the economy. So it's a time when it's particularly easy to stir up opposition to any and all immigration. And at the same time, folks, it's a time when the global crises that I described to you are worsening and much more help is needed. So that gets us to our current challenge, or challenge that I perceive, which is where do we go from here? But Tim, let me find out if there are any questions first before we pivot.
Not currently.
Okay, fine. So where do we go from here? So since half of you knew that those refugees were from Brazil, I'm impressed that maybe all of you know everything that I've said on this call, but I do want to say that it's really important to learn the facts, to understand the old picture of how we came in as immigrants, and to think about and dig down to learn about what's happening now. And then we have to consider how are we going to act in some of the situations that I've described, and what are the ways for us to get involved. So first of all, I want to note the vast number of texts, ancient and modern, most of which I think are really familiar to all of you, that direct us not to stand idly by. There's a sheet of quotes that we don't have to do this, Tim, we can make available to you on request, but I thought I would share 2 with you because they are less well known. One is contemporary and one is from ancient text, and they're quite unusual. One is a quote from a woman named Rosalie Albella. Some of you will remember that she was honored by JTS, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. She is a Jewish woman who is a Canadian Supreme Court Justice. And this is what she wrote. The 3 key lessons of human rights are: 1, that indifference is the incubator of injustice; 2, that it's not what you stand for, it's what you stand up for; and 3, that people must never forget how the world looks to the vulnerable. So while you parse that in your head, I want to share with you my favorite midrashic comment, which is from Midrash Tanhuma, Mishpatim 2. If a person of learning participates in public affairs and serves as judge or arbiter, they give stability to the land. Hopefully that refers to most of the people on this call. But if they sit in their home and say to themselves, what have the affairs of society to do with me? Why should I trouble myself with the people's voices of protest? Let my soul dwell in peace. If one does this, the text says, they overthrow the world. So that is, for me, an extremely powerful observation about the argument for and the need of us to get involved. And the last quote I'd give you before talking about next steps comes from Chancellor Eisen, who last year went to the border with other Jewish clergy. And in his article, talking about what he saw there, which is pretty similar to what I've already shared with you, and citing the obvious Torah commandment to care for the stranger, he said that when people, might be some of you, some of his graduates, some of his donors, when people asked him why he took the trip to the border, he said, because I am a Jew. So, to be involved in the current crises, which I think some of you already are, that involve immigrants and refugees, there are several directions, and they probably all need to be pursued. But please, I am not saying that any one of you needs to pursue all of these. These are different routes that you can go, different routes that your synagogue communities or your local community organizations can go. Taking in asylum seekers, taking them in, not to your homes, but being sure that they are taken into this country and given full and fair hearings. Recognizing populations that are in particular dire straits, I mentioned a few to you already, and seeing that the United States government offers refuge to them. Organizing in our communities to meet the needs of refugees who are here, both to protect them against deportations and to settle them in our communities. And then a big issue, and that is thinking about what our United States policies on immigration should have going forward. So in other words, I'm talking about a combination of direct service and advocacy, of aiding in resettlement, protecting against deportation by showing up in courts, and then getting into this much larger discussion of debating immigration policy. And I want to be clear, since this was an issue that came up somewhat sloppily in the Democratic primaries, none of this is about open borders. It is about setting policies and procedures and designating numbers. And we should be doing it in this country, and we should be doing it in thoughtful discussion with other countries, with geopolitical leaders, with public health experts and economists, with the business leaders I mentioned before who are desperate to have an immigrant population, and with other governments. I am not saying that it's likely that this is a discussion that will be going forward at the next G7 or in Washington right now, but these are the discussions that need to be had. As we move forward, I think we should be considering any and all actions in the light of the pandemic. I'm going to argue from a different point of view now, and in response to what is happening country by country. Because the argument cited is, well, we can't have anyone come in because they might be carrying the disease. The facts are that around the world, as the virus is hitting other countries, some of them are dealing with it infinitely better than we are. But many of them, no matter what rules they put in place, cannot stop the spread of this virus because they cannot do any of the things that each of us is trying to do every day. There is no capacity for social distancing. As I said before, there is often no access to running water or soap. There is no health infrastructure. And I believe that the country of Peru has 3 ventilators. There are a set of numerical observations like that that say that as this virus continues to spread, which I think most epidemiologists and public health officials believe will happen, we will start seeing numbers that dwarf the numbers for the United States, that even dwarf the numbers for New York in terms of populations that are affected. I do want to say about admitting refugees that many countries have done more in this regard than the United States. I would just note that Germany, which is smaller than the size of Montana, accepted over 1 million refugees in the last couple of years, and that Uganda, probably not on all of your minds right now, a country that's about 1/3 the size of Texas, has accepted 1.3 million immigrants from other countries who were in dire straits. I would argue, obviously I wouldn't be doing this presentation for JTS if I didn't believe this, that we should be doing this work as Jews. We were the other and the stranger, and we occupy positions in the United States today of considerable privilege and power. We have to either own our obligation to work for the other and the stranger, because people worked on our behalf, because people rescued Jews from genocide, because people fought to open up borders and admit in those fleeing the Nazis, or we have to deny our heritage, walk away from our obligation to take action, to pursue justice, to never refuse to participate in helping to heal the world. And concretely, we can talk a little bit about what this might mean for each and every one of us, and then take your questions. There is in your attachments, I think, about 1.5 pages from HIAS. So I would say first and foremost, second and foremost, third and foremost on this issue, support HIAS. Because of their history, because of their slogan, which defines the pivot that all of us need to make, because they have both service opportunities and advocacy asks. I think you probably all know this, but the slogan that HIAS adopted about 4 years ago might be the smartest move in advertising I've ever heard. The slogan is, we used to help refugees because they were Jews. Now we help refugees because we are Jews. There are lots of ways with HIAS on your own as individuals and in congregations to work with HIAS, from aiding local refugees to lobbying in Congress for improved conditions at the borders to developing new immigration policy. There actually are opportunities, including virtual Zoom opportunities, for some individuals to engage directly with refugees. If you are a lawyer or a fluent Spanish speaker, people would love to hear from you through HIAS, because we want to ensure that no one trying to secure asylum in the United States goes to a hearing alone. There's the possibility for some of your synagogues and cities and communities to become sanctuaries. Those are places where immigrants who are literally being chased by agents can find respite or protection until they can get a lawyer and fight a deportation move. I think you should all take a huge pride in knowing that last year the Jewish Theological Seminary Board itself determined itself to be a sanctuary by decision of the board. Also, there are regular requests to contribute to bail funds, which allow people to get out of detention, particularly in Texas or California, so they can make their way to relatives in the States, and sometimes so they can fight to be reunited with their children. Coming back to the bulk of this presentation, there are ways to engage ourselves and our families more deeply in our own immigrant histories. I think that on this call, probably many of you know, but if you don't know, do the research to figure out when your ancestors came to the United States, why they came, whether, big reveal here, they came with the proper papers. If they came before 1924, most of them did not have papers. And do this education in our families, in our congregations, in our communities. Pass it down to the next generation. It is our grandchildren who are going to be helping to develop US immigrant policy for the 21st century. And they need to know more than, in my experience, they know today, that they are only a few generations removed from the experience of Guatemalan farmers who are fleeing climate change, or Rohingya Muslims in a refugee camp who are fleeing genocide and COVID-19. Here's one really practical and easy thought. Find the immigration story for your family. If you can, find some of the immigration papers or the original citizenship documents of your ancestors and put them on the Seder plate. Make our story of moving toward freedom real for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Because in fact, many of our fathers and our mothers and our grandparents were actually wandering Aramaeans. Let me close and pivot to your questions by saying that as Jews, we are and are not like other Americans, that our stories are and are not unique, and that our stories, for sure, shed light on today's stories. In my judgment, we need to act for immigrants and refugees, for a sane immigration policy, because of who we are, because we know the story, and because we are charged to take care of today's other and stranger. Thank you. So now I'd be delighted to answer questions, get into a debate, tell you if I don't know the answer to something, pick up on other pieces of this. You do have in the attachments, you have the story of the Jews who landed in New Amsterdam. You have a short couple of pages of quotes that include the quotes that I offered during my presentation. And you have a quick compendium of some of what HIAS is doing and urging people to do right now. You can get much more from the HIAS website. And I think that starting in mid-June, they are going to do their own webinar series that will cover a lot of what I talked about, but it might be a great opportunity to urge other people to call in.
I have a question from Sherry.
Yeah, hi.
Okay.
Just a couple of quick points. One of which is at least in the handouts, the quote you did not offer verbally now was the one from Hillel, which is of course, you know, the hu ha'omer im ein ani li mili, and then o she'ani le'atzmi ma ani. Now I think a better translation than who am I is what am I, which Dr. de Sola-Pool put in his Sephardic Siddur as a translation. And I think that's excellent because in a sense, you are dehumanizing yourself, or at least in terms of your relations to humanity, when you see yourself as a what rather than a who. Second thing was, and it's important too, because from what I understand and have observed as well, that of all the holidays, most Jews will be at a Seder table, as opposed to, let's say, Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah. And I think what's a significant line, of course, is, and why we are so involved in social action or helping others, is the fact that we have to see ourselves, not our ancestors, ourselves coming out of Egypt. And when you see that, you remember what it was like being there and what it was like to be turned away. And you have to react to others. And then just as a quick, very quick footnote to this business of seeing ourselves as wandering as well. And now this has been many, many years ago. I was at a table where let's say the paternal side from Rhodes Lees. And one of the minhagim is for someone to go around the table, like carrying a bag, like a wandering Aramaean, if that's the right quote. I'm not sure I got the quote right, but as a wanderer. Which illustrates again the idea of where we come from. That's it.
Good. Okay. Other useful observations, additions, descriptions of what you're doing, questions? The quiet audience, see? Tim and Julia told me to be sure to ask lots of time for questions. I'm just gonna put up your hands or put a note in the chat. I'm gonna add one or two small points that that occur to me, and one is I think I do use some terms sort of all in the same sentence, so I want to be sure that you understand that the distinction of an immigrant or a migrant is basically anybody who chooses to leave their home. They become an immigrant if they enter another country voluntarily. We use the word refugees more specifically for those people who have been forced to flee their home country, although the definition of what forced is kind of loose. So some people are specifically forced, are taken in by refugee camps. Refugee camps around the world are basically they're obviously, hopefully, supported by the country in which they're located, but they're under the overall aegis of the United Nations because they are people from another country. And the refugee camp that I referred to once or twice specifically is a just totally appalling and terrifying place called Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which has, I believe now, I think, over 1 million Rohingya from Myanmar. but a place with particularly poor infrastructure in a part of the world that's prone to monsoons, and therefore a real breeding ground for both COVID-19 and more generically for cholera. So we are trying, out of American Jewish World Service, we're trying to get some focused attention in the Congress on the situation for the Rohingya.
Ruth, we have a question from Dina Davis in the chat, so I'm going to just read it out loud.
Sure.
I've unmuted her.
Yeah,
Sorry?
go ahead.
Or Dina, unless you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Am I unmuted?
You
You
are.
are, I can hear you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I agree with you about everything you said about the cruelty and injustice of the U.S.'s current immigration policies. I think they are taking up so much of our attention, as they should, and so much of our bandwidth, that what I'm not hearing and I'm craving is a discussion of what a just and rational immigration policy would look like. I mean, you say we're not talking about open borders. So first we have to figure out how many people per year we can usefully absorb. And then we have to figure out who those people are going to be. And that's where I'm not seeing conversation. I mean, is there something, should we start with people who need us the most? Should we start with people who happen to be born in countries that share our borders? Is there any role for thinking about our country and what elements in it we want to strengthen and what kind of people we want to welcome here in terms of looking forward? I'm not hearing anything about that, and I find that frustrating. Thank you.
No, I mean, I would just say, I think you asked every single correct question, and the answer to any of those questions is yes, indeed, that could, or maybe in some cases should be part of our development of a policy. And you are right that it's shocking that that conversation basically was shrunk before the impact of the virus. And then it was just these last 4 months that was like, okay, now we know we're not going to talk about anybody coming in because they're going to infect us, when in fact, actually, you know, they have a better record than we do, but that's not, you know, they're testing people walking into my apartment building and taking their temperature. It's easy to figure out who should or shouldn't come in. But it's all the questions you ask, and all of those are elements of a sane policy. And the point I wanted to make, which I think you got directly, is that under Presidents Coolidge and Harding, the standard that was used was pretty wacky. It was just like, we don't want to upset any apple carts. So if 3% of the American population was Italian first generation, then 3% of who we admit will be Italian. I mean, that's the way they did it. They did it with like a formula. They didn't ask the questions that you're asking. And it is a fact that about, I think I want to say, I'm not exactly sure, Dina, but I want to say sort of at the cusp of 2016, the last change in the White House, both a little bit before that and a little bit after that, there were bipartisan groups in the Congress who were saying, let's sit down and talk about what the elements of a immigration policy are. And in response to everything that's going on, if that conversation is still happening anyplace, I don't know where it is. And as we go into, I will be as nonpartisan as I possibly can, Julia, as we go into an election season in 2020, whenever you're looking, wherever you live in the United States, there are people running for office, Congress, House of Representatives, Senate. This is a question, is like, what's your attitude toward immigration? And I'm afraid that many of them will, since I'm a former elected official, I can say this, I guess, will dodge the question or will give you a kind of, parv answer. Because they're afraid to talk about exactly the issues that Dina raised. And that's why I highlighted, and I really want to say this, that this is a conversation that our Congress should be having with business leaders, because they will tell you that, when somebody is posting, there are more pressing issues. yes and no. I mean, here's a side notion, but we just got quality health services, okay? There are no vaccines, of course, but quality health exams and testing around COVID-19. Some of you may be from Florida. We just got the governor of Florida, activists is the we here, to agree to put in comprehensive health services where the people are picking tomatoes. Because those are immigrants who are in this country as a workforce on which we depend. I mean, yes, you could do without tomatoes, I suppose, but you understand what I'm saying. The growers need people to pick their tomatoes. There were a lot of issues 2 years ago about the living conditions and the working conditions for those workers, where we didn't make a lot of headway. We now made headway with regard to COVID, because if they transmit the virus, then they won't be picking tomatoes. So one question is what do businesses need? There was a night about 3 years ago, it didn't catch on as much as it was supposed to, but in some large cities, restaurant owners closed their restaurants on the same night and told their patrons that they were closing their restaurants because if the government's proposals on immigration went through, there would be nobody to do the work in these restaurants that some of us enjoy. So I think it's just, for me, it's an interesting issue, because I think there really is a cross-party network that should be thinking about immigration policy for the future. And I think Dina raised all the right questions. Which countries, which skills, what do we offer? And some of that for me is, in which countries is it impossible for people literally to continue to live?
I have a question from E. Hoffman.
Someone? Question, Hoffman? I'm having fun looking at these pictures to see who I know. Hello, Harold Jacobson. You're muted, but I'm very happy to see you.
Myself.
Okay, Lee, go ahead.
My question is, how can someone like Stephen Miller, whose ancestors were Holocaust survivors and whose uncle reprimanded him for his policies, be so right-wing and so unaware of, the immigration of his past?
I must say I really don't understand. I mean, he's a particular dramatic example, both because he appears to be the lead advisor and proponent, certainly the lead advisor in the government, encouraging this anti-all immigrants and all immigration, and fueling some of the comments that some of you put in the chat room about bad people, invasions, shithole countries. And his uncle chose to out him publicly and say, this is, let me tell you who my nephew is, let me tell you what his family story is, but it has made no impact on him. And I haven't, if he has agreed to be questioned on any news show, I haven't seen it, because it would be interesting to know how he speaks to this. But you just give me a chance to reinforce my message, which is, I urge you, if you're getting further engaged in studying this, to try to look at the strong similarities between when our ancestors came in and why, and what's happening today. Because it's too easy for people to say, oh, that was different. We were eager to be here, ready to be assimilated, eager to learn English. And the stories are much more complicated than that.
Doug?
Hey, I'm going to out myself as a lawyer. I'm a partner at a firm called Mintz in Boston. I just did a highest asylum case, by the way. I can't tell you, Ruth, the highest message, thank you. We all need to reach into our pockets if we can to help. But I just wanted to make a comment, and it's unfortunate, but we're in a situation where we have a president and an administration that doesn't believe that Congress matters in this debate. Trump has utilized executive orders left and right to restrict the entry of people like no other president in our time. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill myself, and have done a lot of government relations work in this space, the biggest challenge is that Americans link immigration with security concerns. And since 9/11, this has been the lingo that the extreme right has taken and really popularized. And this really means getting the Senate and the House and getting both parties to agree on immigration is so unlikely, because unfortunately, the ability to come together and talk and solve the issue would mean coming to the center. I'm not a Reaganist or a Republican, but the last real action we had in Congress and with a president that actually helped people who are the ones who need help the most was under Reagan, when Reagan legalized agricultural workers with a Democratic Congress. So I'm 100% behind everything you say. I'm somewhat skeptical about an ability to get reform on the table, because I think that both parties are afraid of voters. They're afraid of the, I hate saying it, but the Rust Belt. As a native Ohioan, I can say the Rust Belt is a problem. And we have never seen a time like this, where a president has used executive power to curtail and restrain entry. It's really it's ahistorical.
Well, I mean, I thank you. I agree, and I think, but I was glad I'm glad that the conversation now pivoted a little bit to, like, what do we do? Washington looks so helpless on this, or hopeless on this, because it's not going to stay this way forever, we hope. And the question is, as we move forward, where are going to be the voices? I guess that's what I'd say to you. Where are going to be the voices for redeveloping a sane immigration policy, which is becoming more and more complicated all along? And it's absolutely clear to me that, and somebody just said this is against the president. No, I think Doug's point was exactly right. There are members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are finding it really hard to talk about immigration right now. And I actually once asked Hyas, and they told me they would do it if I could raise the money, but I couldn't raise the money. But I asked Hyas if they would entertain a research project to be done by smart students that would look at the immigrant history of every one of the 535 members of Congress. Because we won some immigrant legislation, believe me, I can't remember who, but we went and got the support of a fairly vocal Republican member of Congress by talking to him about his own immigration status. So I think there's a lot to go, and I do not think that this should not be, this is an American challenge as a country. Elsewhere around the world, there are immigrant policies and practices. There are asylum practices. That's why I said there are actually 70 million immigrants and refugees in the world. So we're not the only country, but we want to be one of the countries that engages its leaders, both elected and non-elected, in figuring out a policy for the rest of the 21st century. And I think that as Jews, because of our Bible and our text and our sense of obligation, and because of our history, both ancient and modern, we have a particular role to play here. Other questions, challenges? I love to read what you're saying in the chat room, but I can't do that fast enough.
Is that Elaine with a question?
Okay. Hi. I was wondering whether is there any group or groups in the Jewish community anywhere globally that you're aware of that is treating immigration as a global issue because there's a way in which I think Jews should be thinking globally. And that brings up the third rail of open borders and birthright citizenship, and a book that Professor Shachar at Rutgers wrote called The Birthright Lottery, that we're only where we are out of our good fortune or our bad fortune, depending, but it's a lottery. That's it.
Is in groups elsewhere in the world, and that a while ago, I think less so right now because of the challenges on the southern border here, but a while ago I worked, when I was at American Jewish World Service, I worked with HIAS on helping refugees from the genocide in Darfur, both people who were in internally displaced camps still in Sudan, and people who were across the line in Chad. And HIAS set up programs and recruited both Americans and others to go work in these refugee camps. So they at least had a picture of like some of the places that there are other refugees. And many other countries have really good not-for-profit organizations that are committed to working around the world with refugees. A small plug for American Jewish World Service, we work with refugee populations in various of the countries where we work, and right now are doing a lot of work around COVID in the countries where we work. But beyond that, I will say that there are really good groups, without getting into a battle, there are really good groups on different sides of this issue in Israel, where there are African refugees, and there are really good groups trying to raise the questions with the Israeli government about what its policies and practices should be with regard to immigrants in that country. And by the way, one thing that's just a side note is that this goes back a few years, so I'm not saying that this is still true, but there was a point at which Sudanese, the country that I actually know a lot about, which Sudanese refugees in Israel were being put in prison while their status was being determined. And the groups that were fighting for them and advocating for them were told by the refugees, we would much rather be in prison in Israel than in the streets of Sudan. So don't worry so much about us. We'll get through this. Just an interesting commentary. William Lewis had a question. Your hand. You have to unmute yourself. No, we can't hear you yet. You're still muted. Your mouth is moving. You can see how much I like Zoom. Julia, if you're going to do this till August, figure out something.
There we go. First, before I ask a question, I want to give some information that people may not know. If you know people who are undocumented but are working, you don't need to have. One of these days, they're going to say those people who are undocumented, who are paying their taxes, will get on the line ahead of others. You can, even if you're undocumented, you can get what they call a tax ID number without giving up an address and without endangering yourself. Most people don't know this. I believe in the future that will be one of the things that will be taken into consideration. I know that there's one group of people who do this regularly. It's the Irish. They make sure they get a tax ID number and they pay their taxes. Now for my question. I personally agree with everything you've said about the troubles we're having with immigration and the immigration policy on the conceptual level, on the operational level, practical level. I'm not sure what to do. If we are to place ourselves both as Jews and Americans as the taker in the place of refuge for the whole world, should we also take on the responsibility of trying to make the places they are coming from safe? If people are leaving Guatemala and El Salvador because of the gangs, should we be going in there and getting rid of the gangs? Should we be going in there, and should we be going in there to feed the people there? Not the rich people and not the government, but the people directly. how much interaction should we have there? Also, that's one question I have. And also, I beg those people who are involved in immigration, if you are against what we call illegal immigration of all sorts, that doesn't mean we're against immigration. My mother was an immigrant. My grandparents were both immigrants. I believe in immigration. And by the way, even the person we call the First Nations, or you call them Native Americans, were not natives. They were also immigrants. But I think that we have to be careful. Europe is having a lot of problems with crimes right now. They've taken in refugees. I always discount the news because it may be coming from right-wing sources, but still, I know the problems. Britain's having the honor killing problems, another number of other problems, and the anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitic problems that have arisen through the refugees. So these are the things that Dina brought some of this up. These are some of the practical questions that have to be asked. Thank you. And I really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I certainly agree with your and Dina's points about all those practical questions. I'm embarrassed that I left out of my remarks the first point you made. So yes, absolutely. Particularly when it comes to Latin America, part of the problem is that US aid has been cut, and US aid, even when it was there, as you alluded, was not necessarily targeted to some of the issues. If we work against very high levels of corruption in some of these countries, if we work specifically against gangs, which we certainly have a history of having done out of our State Department, not only would fewer people want to leave, William, but I want to emphasize what I said before from that poem I read. They want to stay in many instances. Look, many people want to leave. Many people have relatives here. They have 1,000 reasons they think that America is perfect. Still, they want to come. But there are large numbers of people who are coming now who are fleeing in terror, which is a story that we know something about. And in this case, William is absolutely right, and I forgot to mention it, a targeted, thoughtful US policy toward Guatemala, toward Mexico, toward Haiti for sure, would mean that many fewer people would determine that they needed to flee for their lives or their survival. So it's a big piece of what we need to do.
One more question from Wolpert.
Yes, my video isn't working. The question is, does HIAS have any kind of a proposed or suggested policy statement of what a reasonable immigration policy would look like? How many total people? How do you distribute among the different countries? What's the basis for this appropriation?
So I don't want to do them any damage. My guess is no, except in the most general parameters, because HIAS, again, remember, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and we know its history in helping our families. Virtually all of HIAS's work, maybe, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago, was to help people who were arriving here. The pivot that I talked about that they made to helping Vietnamese people and Laotian people and Mexican people was their perception that, like, okay, the people who are arriving today who need help are not Jewish, but because we're Jewish, we want to help them. And then, as I said a minute ago, I saw HIAS get involved in refugee camps and refugee services elsewhere in the world, which was a huge step for them. And now they are, as you can see from the material that I put out, they have like 6 or 7 asks just focused on immediate advocacy. So I want to say that I think that that's where their strength lies, and that while Mark Hatfield, their CEO, probably has lots and lots of thoughts, and maybe his board has people about what would be the elements of developing a full-scale immigrant policy, that that's not particularly where they're at just now. And I also want to say that they have contracts with the federal government, which I think still survive, to provide some services to immigrants. And what that means is, in this climate, that any advocacy positions that they take, and they have taken several, jeopardize their federal grants.
So on that note, we're going to wrap up. I just wanted to say a couple things. First, Ruth, thank you so much. I'm actually, personally, I'm taking the charge from you to start looking into my own family migration history, which I've been meaning to do for a long time, but I'm gonna take you up on your challenge. And I want to thank you not only for for sharing all of this, the information and your perspective and tying it in with our history as Jews, but also modeling what it looks like to have a really calm, respectful conversation about a really charged issue, which I think we can also really take that lesson from you for a lot of other issues that we're dealing with now as a society. So thank you very much for sharing with us today. I want to make sure people know about our session next week, which is going to be really interesting, with JTS Fellow Dr. Michal Rauscher. This is going to be a totally novel take on the question of Jewish continuity, and is there a Jewish continuity crisis? How do we define such a crisis? If there is one, how do we approach it? So I can guarantee you it will be something new that you've never heard before. I want to encourage you to join us, and wish everyone a good week, a healthy week, and we can close, as Ruth opened up, with prayers for peace and healing for all those who need.
Thank you.